This is the Local Real Estate Developer Podcast, where we share the stories of locals across the country who took that empty lot or that old building and turned it into something awesome that their community needs. I'm Kristi Kandel, and I've been a real estate developer my entire career. My co-host Raphael is a commercial broker, and together we're sharing the stories of locals making a huge impact on their communities. And what we've learned is you don't need millions in the bank or decades of experience to get started. You just need the confidence, tools, and the right people around you. This podcast is your chance to gain the confidence to get in the game, because real estate development isn't just for the insiders anymore. It's for people like you too.
Welcome to the Local Real Estate Developers Podcast. I'm your co-host, Raphael. I am a commercial broker, investor, and aspiring developer located here in Louisville, Kentucky. And I'm here with my co-host, Kristi Kandel, developer extraordinaire, located here in Southwest Florida.
Hey, Kristi Kandel. I'm a developer, investor, and I teach locals how to become developers in their own backyard. And today we have a guest, Lance Cox, who was in a real estate group that I was in. And when I found out he was a developer, I was like, hey, let's get him on. So Lance, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Awesome. No, well, we were talking a little bit offline that you're located in Missoula, Montana. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Good old Western Montana.
That's amazing. Yeah, no, I mentioned to you a little bit offline. I used to work in a previous career, and the company that I was a part of used to recruit heavily out of Montana, the University of Montana. So it was really cool to see, people that have those experiences in that area. I need to go one day. I'm really excited to check out. I hear great things about the scenery and the outdoor space in Montana.
Yeah, people like to vacation up here, and so I say, well, you might as well invest up here and write your trip off, right?
There you go.
Come check
True
it out.
I'm sure we'll get into this. We'll probably get into some of that, I'm sure, as we get into it. But, out of curiosity, I know you have met Kristi through a group you're in, but for those who are listening that maybe don't know your background, if you could kind of share a little bit about your backstory, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in construction here in Montana, working for a developer. Slowly moved on, went out of state, worked for some bigger players. I worked for Centex Homes for a while in Southern California. Our division down there built 1,600 homes a year. So it was wild going from one of the larger Missoula developers that we'd build, maybe 20 things a year to 1,600. So it was wild to see that, the differences, similarities, but just the production and things that they did. From there, when the housing bubble burst, kicked me out of residential construction. So I landed in commercial. I built high schools and college buildings for a while, and then moved over to consult at Disneyland. 5 or 6 years as an employee or a consultant, and then I moved back to Montana and have been developing real estate and being an entrepreneur and getting involved with other businesses ever since.
That's amazing. How was the Disney experience? I mean, it's kind of fascinating because they are just, the scale at which they develop all these different parks and all the other real estate that they own outside of just the parks.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting. I went in and I'm like, well, I know construction, and then they're right off the bat, they're like, well, you're gonna learn the Disney way, which is different. Their contracts are very interesting. I remember reading the contracts, and in it was like, if you don't have an approved change order, then you've donated your time and materials to the Walt Disney Company. And I was like, holy cow! I'm like, do you guys enforce this? And they're like, well, if we need to, but they're like, no, we work with contractors, we know the deal. They know how we work, but I was like, I don't know who would want to sign this contract, but people want to do the Disney work. So you just have to learn the Disney way, right? But yeah, we did some complicated things. I had some fun projects for all over the place in different areas of the different parks and the resorts, and all the way down to, putting flames on top of roofs. So it's like, well, I'll probably never get to do that again. But if someone's ever like, I need that done, well, at least I know how to do that. But, and then I finished with a Club 33 project. You could Google that one. It tells you all about it out there. But it was very fascinating, a very different type of work. And you're planning around things that in everyday development you don't necessarily have, but we still had to deal with the city of Anaheim, getting through there.
Well, I'm curious what you thought of your experience of working in SoCal and then coming back to Montana and the differences. Because I came from the Midwest, and then most of my career was California, so I know all the red tape and loveliness out there. So I'm just curious of your opinion.
Well, so it's fascinating. So I had a lot of people that when I moved back to Montana, I forgot about how slow paced everything was, to where like you go through the grocery line and people are talking to you and they're bagging your groceries really slow. And I remember my wife was like, man, can they hurry it up? Well, I want to get out of here, And I was like, this is just the difference, it's just, it is what it is. And so I thought, well, coming back to Montana, development's going to be a breeze compared to California, and turns out Missoula is a very difficult place to develop. And other parts of Missoula or other parts of Montana are very different. So we've got some areas that might feel like the wild, wild west of there's no requirements. You can almost do anything you want. And then you get to other places and it's very, very difficult. Here in Missoula, we had a project. One of my partners just bought myself and the other partners out, but it took 4 years to go from purchase of that to our final plat for just our first phase. And I thought, man, that is crazy. I mean, that outpaced California, And there's a lot of stories in and amongst that, but some of the things that they would do just left me scratching. And a lot of the other developers here, and some guys are like, I'm going to go outside of Missoula because it's so difficult. So it's surprising that just our little bubble is very difficult, but California definitely prepped me for it a little bit more than I thought it would.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because obviously, when out from an outside perspective looking in, you would think that in Montana maybe it's a little bit easier to get things done than other states like California. But to your point, development's all localized. So there may be a scenario where in Missoula it's a very difficult place based on a variety of different factors, but maybe 50 miles away in another city, they're a lot more lenient to do certain things. And I've noticed that in different markets that we operate in, where certain areas of town are much more difficult to deal with than if you're focused in on another subsection of just the same city, because depending on how it's all broken down. So it just kind of goes to show the importance of understanding the local market dynamics, because it's really going to be able to what's going to enable you to get things done, and whether or not that takes a month or 3 years. It's just you need to understand that. So
yeah, and like we see that pretty well between even the city and the county, and they don't. It's not like they have perfect boundaries, and they're going all over the place. And so you look at a piece of property and like, oh, okay, you know what to expect, and then you look it up and you're like, oh, this is an unregistered part of the county. I can do whatever I want. Where across the street, you're like, yep, nope, that's city, and that's toast.
Oh yeah, yeah. In our local market here in Louisville, we have like the main city, and then we have sub cities. When you are, you may get a directive or approval for do certain things from the city of Louisville, but then when it goes down to the local level of the city within the city, then it may be a little bit more difficult to get things done. And so, to your point, you could be on one side of the street and be in that smaller city, and then all of a sudden you go across the street and you're in a different, not necessarily different rules apply, but different people you have to get on board apply. And depending on what that local area's agenda is, then obviously it could drive what can get done. So, yeah, it's funny because you see it all the time. I'm sure you do too, where you're driving down the street and you see a building that's been vacant for a while. It's like, I wonder why no one's done anything with that building. It's in a great spot, and then you're like, I'm pretty sure I probably know why nothing's been done.
Yeah. That's our city in a nutshell. Like between TIF district or some weird zoning overlay here, and it's like, well, okay, that's why you got what you got.
Do you find it, just out of curiosity, is it environmental protection for just what that is? Is it just local politics and people wanting their community to be a certain way, or something else?
I think for my city, it's a little bit of both, for sure. I've got a development that's near a river, and there was a new rule that says, hey, you guys can't put a house within 500 feet of the edge of the river. And I'm thinking, well, if you're down at river level, I can understand why the people concerned about the fish said, hey, we need to be farther away. We can't just put decks right on the edge of that river. But like my development sits several hundred feet above. And well, that's certainly not going to have any of the same effect. But, that wasn't really taken into consideration. But we do have a lot of politic things in my particular little city. We get a lot of people just vote in everything in the world. And so it gets more difficult, and it's a challenge. Our city is challenged from that standpoint.
Will you go to planning commissions and stuff and just sit in to kind of see what the pulse is? Or do you have a good enough pulse at this point that you know what's happening and who has what agenda?
Yeah, so I do go to some on occasion. My engineers go a lot. They keep us abreast of what's going on. There's times where they ask us to come in and voice our opinions. when you feel like your opinion is not ever listened to or matters, then you tend to just, after a while, be like, I'm not even going to bother doing.
Yeah. So out of curiosity, you've had a lot of construction experience in your lifetime. You worked in different capacities and on different teams, both on the smaller end and then obviously on these larger teams for these large corporations. What was the impetus for you wanting to kind of branch out on your own? And maybe if you could talk about the first project you took on, because the people that are listening to this podcast oftentimes are people who are either still at their job and they want to take on their first development, or B, they're wanting to make that jump into a more entrepreneurial endeavor, whether that's whatever that is, whether that's starting your own business and then also maybe buying a piece of real estate to then develop yourself, however that is. So if you could share some insights, that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, for me, may sound terrible to some, but I just got tired of California, and so I was like, I want to go, but I didn't know where I necessarily wanted to go. And I grew up working for a developer, and I watched him grow, and he not only developed some subdivisions and apartments and single family and rentals, but he built a huge real estate rental portfolio. And so I was like, I want to duplicate what he did because that was very successful. And my neighbor at the time, Rick, he worked for this guy, and that's how I became. And then those guys started developing together. So it was really great to watch Rick's, ascension through the development game. So years later, Rick's son-in-law, Brian, we became business partners. We were like brothers, and we started talking about what business opportunities we could do together. And so eventually he called me one day. He's like, hey, look at this 5-acre parcel. He's like, I found it. I thought, man, this would be great for apartments or maybe townhomes. And so I was like, well, and I was just getting familiar again with the Missoula market, and I was like, I kind of feel like apartments at the time, this was back in 2016. I was like, I feel like we're getting, maybe a little built out in apartments, so I liked the townhome option, but townhomes were not hot at the time. They were just not a lot of people were building them. And when we laid out the parcel, it was like, okay, this is going to be 56 townhomes, which was quite a large. And so, we had a TED up here, a townhome, gosh, I can't think of what it is, but a townhome exemption declaration process, right? Instead of going through subdivision, you still go through a lot of the same things, but just some of the has some fewer requirements. But anyway, so we're like, let's take this through the townhomes and through the TED. And so that's what we ended up doing. And the project went really well. It was just the right thing at the right time in the market, and we were a little nervous because no one had done a townhome development that large. But that was for me what brought me back, so I was consulting full time at Disneyland, looking like, what do I do is my next step. Didn't want to be in California. And so just, it was just the reality of just the right project at the right time with the right person, and moved on back. Got a big jump, moved halfway across the country again.
So when you were doing that, I was just talking to someone the other day and they were trying to figure out how does that look? Do they build it all at once? Can you maybe break down how you did it, whether it was in phases and what type of construction loan and permanent loans and kind of how that part broke out in that?
Yeah, we ended up doing the infrastructure in 2 phases. And that was partly definitely a funding thing, because I was new going on my own. Brian had been out on his own and he'd had some success too. But also here in Montana, if you go from a 5-acre parcel and then you create these 56 lots, as soon as that next year cycle comes around, you're paying property tax on 56 lots, right? And you go from 1 lot to 56, and the original lot was a very low tax because it had a single house on there that was somebody's old farm, right? So very low tax basis. And all of a sudden it's like, well, your new lot is, each lot was probably equivalent to what that 1 lot was worth times 56. So I was like, we definitely need to phase this. We weren't entirely sure if we should do fewer phases. So infrastructure wise, we did it in 2 phases, but I thought, well, maybe we should actually do it from a tax filing, like a lot creation, maybe in 3 or 4 phases. That way we're just limiting, because we didn't know how fast the product was going to move either. So that was kind of how we went into it. Funding was something that, that was a hurdle that we had to get over, because while I had plenty of experience, and I check off all the boxes, I didn't have a huge pile of capital, neither did Brian, So we talked to all sorts of private lenders. We talked to local real estate investors, a bunch of different things. Brian's father-in-law ended up being part of what helped that happen. But really the big thing that helped us there was a new bank. Well, I shouldn't say a new bank, because it was a local Montana bank, Stockman Bank. They don't operate outside Montana, but they were new to Missoula, to our area. And so they came in and they just said, hey guys, we're really aggressive. We want to grow the market. So we met with them. And the funny thing, when we met with them, they were like, here's all of our requirements. We put this much down, and we do this and this and that. And I said in the meeting, I think I probably hurt somebody's feelings, but I said, you guys said you're the most aggressive, but you want the most down. You give us the highest rates. That's not the most aggressive. And it kind of fizzled out the meeting. And then we went back to them probably 3-4 weeks later, and we said, hey, if you guys do want to be aggressive, here's where we are. We need a loan. Our closing date's coming up. Do you want to do it? And they did get creative, and they did something that banks wouldn't do, letting us do some double pledging and things. And so I was like, okay, you guys are aggressive, but they are also a really conservative bank, like in a lot of cities, you see banks that are just like, fire sailing off a property that they got back from another developer. Right. And so one day I've been with this bank ever since. My office is actually in their building on the second floor today. And so I have a good working relationship with them. But one day I went down and I was like, how come you guys never call me and be like, hey, Lance, we have a fire sale property opportunity. Like, why am I never on the call list? And they said, because we don't ever have any properties to fire sale. And I'm like, oh, yes, because you have to put so much down, So, but all in good fun. But realistically, they are a conservative bank, but they want to make sure that they're protecting the person, And so, but I've met with plenty of lenders that are on the other side, especially private money guys. They're like, we'll give you money, whatever you want. Here's your interest rate. And you look at it and it's like, do they really care if I succeed or fail? I'm sure they don't really want a property back that's underwater. But at the same time, they're probably thinking, well, if I get it back, I'll just sell it to another guy with the same term, make as much money. And so that was, really eye-opening, going through the different types of lending options and things. That was my funding experience.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, because to your point regarding funding, I mean, that's an important piece of the puzzle in any project. And oftentimes you talk to a lot of different banks, and on the private lending side, what my experience has been is that a lot of times they invest in the person. They kind of talk to you, they get a feeling for what your background is, your reputation in town, and over time, once you build a relationship with them, they just fund. They say, okay, well, do you believe this is a good idea? Okay, well, let's move forward. And it takes time to earn that trust, but I feel like in those situations, it can be that way. And I've noticed that to be the case also in local, like regional banks that, obviously you deal with on a regular basis. I work a lot with some local bankers that I've sent deals to through my brokerage activity, but also I've funded some of my own deals through the bank. And, obviously I've, built that relationship and paid off, well, not paid off notes, but I'm regularly paying notes. And so since that relationship's been cemented, I can send opportunities to them whenever. And they even if the opportunities, it's a vacant building, they'll be like, okay, Raphael's involved. Okay, let's see if we can make the deal work, and can kind of figure out from there. Because I've shown in the past that I was able to kind of turn that into an opportunity for the bank. So
yeah. That's really important. I think people underestimate how important those banking relationships are. I think a lot of people are just like, oh, they're just a bank, But like, I just did a transaction. I think we closed on a couple months ago, but it was, the bank told me, they said, this is the first time we've ever done this. And when I took the opportunity to them, they're like, it could be done. They're like, it's not something we normally do. I'm like, I know, but it's me, guys. Let's get it done. And so it took a little while to get it done, and there was a lot of extra, lawyer drafting of paperwork and things to be had. But they did. They got a deal done that I don't think any other bank would have done. And they told me, they're like, if we didn't have this past history, they're like, there's no way we would have done this alone. And so that was really valuable.
Yeah, that's awesome. So Regarding that townhome development, how did you guys phase out the project? And did you guys do pre-sales, like do the concept drawings, and then you kind of put it out to the marketplace and say, hey, here's what we're trying to do? We have people put down like $1,000 to hold their spot in line or something like that? Or how did you approach that process?
Hey, can we chat for a second? Since you're listening to this podcast, you're already thinking like a developer. You see the potential in your community, and you're ready to do more than just watch from the sidelines. That's exactly why we created the Local Developer Vault. It's a free resource full of tools, templates, and trainings to help you take action. And here's the best part. When you sign up, you'll also get access to our local real estate developer community. It's full of people just like you who are making real things happen in their neighborhoods. So don't just listen to the stories. Become the next one that we spotlight on our show. The link in the show notes to unlock the vault and join our movement.
Yes. So part of our initial start was getting a little bit of private money from Brian's father-in-law. He invested in, and he's like, hey, I want to own some of those as rentals. So that gave us a great little start. But we thought, like, we can list these things. So this is back in 2016, or maybe we listed some in 2015. I think we started listing them in 2016 though. And back then we had 2 floor plans, and we listed them at 223 and 226, I think. With the interest rates back then and buying power, literally anybody could buy one. It didn't matter what your job was. You could be a single mother. You could work at a gas station. Doesn't matter where what economic life you were in. You could buy one of these townhomes, And you fast forward today, and these townhomes are now selling for $465. And if you're in that same spot, in that same job, you can't go get a loan now. It's really unfortunate. But back then we were like, man, we should be able to sell these things, no problem. So our realtors out there pitching it, trying to get more first-time home buyers, because that's really what we thought our target market was going to be. We're like, we're going to get first-time home buyers. People can't afford a house, but they can afford a townhome. And we drew investor attention, because they would cash flow. And so we picked up a couple more investors. And I was like, at some point, I remember telling my realtor, like, we don't want to be 100% investors, and we don't want to be even too high of investors, because then you have situations where some of the lenders look at these townhome developments. They kind of, there's not a crystal clear line between condos and townhomes, and you get too high in condo ownership, and then sometimes it's hard for a first-time home buyer to get a loan. So like, well, these are all investments, and that's a whole different ball of wax. But so I was like, I told our realtor, I said, we should probably start telling investors no, so that we can find some first-time home buyers. And so we're churning along with construction with our investor units, and in our first phase, and we finally got our first homeowner under contract. And then we got a second, but it took a long time. We really thought like we could pre-market everything. I think we got our first buyer. We were probably, I want to say we were right around the insulation or drywall stage when they went under contract. So it was not very early on in the game. Once we had units built, then we were able to pre-sell some things, which was pretty easy because we were building so many units at once. I mean, we were turning over 22 to 24 units a year, and we were staggering all the trades, right? So a person could come on site and they could be like, hey, I want to see what this looks like. They could see a foundation here. They could see a framed one here. They could see mechanical over here. They could see a finished unit there. So it was really nice from a sales standpoint, because we didn't need a model. We talked about, do we do a model? And we didn't need one just because there was always something to look at. And so once we had that up, then it was easier. And then it was like all of a sudden the switch flipped, and we couldn't sell. We were selling so fast, we couldn't build fast enough, and we didn't have enough inventory. Like realtors would call me and they're like, hey, we know you're building over there. Do you have any? And I'm like, sorry, everything is either spoken for or under contract or whatever. And we never had a single of those 56 units get built and then go on the MLS and sit there. Everything built and closed. Our market today is not the same. I see people building townhomes and they're sitting, and there's all obviously different reasons why. But back then it was initially really hard And I remember we met with our very first homeowner on site. He was moving to Missoula for a new job, and we met with him and his mom. And we were walking around the neighborhood, and they were a little leery about being like the first people to buy, outside of investors. But they felt comfortable and it worked out great. And so, but it definitely was not, it didn't go to per plan for us when we thought we could pre-sell everything, not even remotely close.
Yeah. Well, I mean, go ahead, Kristi.
I was going to ask, so then with this, and you have the overall development, you created an HOA out of that, right?
We did.
Or
yep.
how did that?
Yeah, we had shared property, right? So the townhome exemption basically created a road, sidewalks, little park, some common area that was not owned by the city. The city doesn't own the road. So they've got all the easements, to be able to drive and do what they need to do, but it is all technically owned by the HOA. And so we had to set up an HOA. And so it was kind of interesting when we set up that HOA, we thought, well, how do people like HOAs? And I'd lived in places, especially in California, that had HOAs. And I even lived in a condo. And so I had seen kind of a big window of like what HOAs were like. And so we made ours a little bit different because we thought, well, people like for the outside of their houses to look nice and for the neighborhood to look nice. And so while every person owned their own individual townhome, it wasn't like a condo where it was like, studs in or anything like that. You have a shared lot line, but you physically own everything on your lot. But we decided at the time, we're like, well, we ought to put in the HOA that we're going to set money aside for like roof replacements and painting so that in the future, 20 years or 30 years, you don't have somebody with a bad roof and then they have to come in on the other side and go to their neighbor and say, hey, we need to replace the roof. I've got money, but you don't. How are we going to deal with this? Because, when you have a roof plane that interweaves shingles, you can't just cut a line down the middle, right? And we thought, well, if we put money aside to repaint those in 20, 30 years, then, or 15, whatever it is, it'll just keep property values up. Things will look nicer, And so we wrote ours a little different. And it's interesting. You fast forward 10 years now, and they've gone through different property managers. I'm not involved anymore, but they call me for like questions or things still. And I repeatedly tell them, I'm like, I'm pretty sure you guys are still having, because, I told the property manager, I'm like, you need to do these analyses of how much money needs to be set aside and when you need to raise the HOA fees and things like that. And they're not doing it right now. So at some point, and I told them, I'm like, you guys either need to go in and change what's in the HOA and say, we're no longer going to set money aside for this, or you need to up the fees because you don't have the money set aside that you're supposed to be planning for. And I've repeatedly told this to them, every year, but it's falling on deaf ears apparently.
Well,
but it also took me a long time to get off the board because nobody wanted to jump on the board. And I think right now I got a call from a lady maybe a month or two ago, and she was new to the neighborhood and didn't know how things worked. And so she's had a bunch of questions, and I think the board was down to one person. So then she hopped on to help out, And so, I was like, at some point the board might just get dissolved, but the problem is they have common property, so you can't, like, it has to be maintained somehow. It's not going to come in and, take over those things either, and there's a common waterway and some bridges and, or pedestrian bridges. And so, it has to exist. There's no
Are there third party like HOA management companies? Okay. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming they didn't want to consider doing that, or I guess in that case, they still have the board is required because they're the ones who are making the decision on what to do.
No, we hired a third party HOA manager from day one, and they still have one, different one than when we started with, but they still have one. Yeah. But there's only 2 members on the actual board that are current residents of the HOA.
Yeah, my first 2 properties were townhomes, but that was in a community in Tahoe that was built for, it had 330 units. So we had the homeowners that were on the board, and then we had enough property density that we could have an in-house GM and everything. But then across the street, we had, I think there's 8 fourplexes. And so we're dealing with that in Nevada. We're constantly having turnover of who the HOA management company is to keep us in compliance, and basically begging the owners to please be on the board. We have to officially do these notes and things. But yeah, each owner owns their own building. But at the same time, you've got the shared parking lot. You have snow removal. You have landscape. You have when the utilities, when something happens. So it's very interesting. I personally try and stay away from ownership of that when it comes to residential. So I'm down to one. But I love the concept of how you set it up to say, hey, the roof, because that came up a ton where there was, in the first development, there were 4 owners. So 4 townhomes per overall structure. And yeah, if only one person has the money for the roof, it's like, who else is going to pony up? So we did have the exterior paint on there, but the roofs I don't think were. So that was another, like, how do you do that?
Well, and what's interesting is every year, so I used to go to the, the HOA meetings every year, and we'd have new people. And so they would ask, they're like, well, why is there money going to this or money going to that? And I would explain it to them, like, this is what the purpose behind it is. And I also told everyone, like, guys, remember, like, there's 56 votes. If you don't want to do this, you can change it. You can do something different. And then they're like, okay, let's vote on it. And everyone would vote to keep it in. But again, like, nobody wants to set more money aside for it. And and it's kind of interesting because, like, some people that call me with questions, it's like they think the HOA is other than themselves. They're like, well, if this doesn't get done right, I'm going to sue the HOA. I'm like, that's fine. You're suing yourself and your neighbors. It's not like an external city. It's not an external. It is you and everyone else who lives there, And it's like, if you don't want to have money for this in the future, then don't charge yourself for it. But like, some people will be there for many years or decades. And so they're probably sitting there going like, yeah, this is nice. I want to set that aside. But they're going to run into a problem at some point where they're going to be like, we don't have this. And it's either going to be like, well, we voted out, or there's going to just be this huge charge to everybody.
Special assessments and everything. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's why it's so important too. And I know on the residential side, you can potentially get access to this, but when I'm working with owners, I've sold a good amount of office condos in the past. And every time we look at office condos, I'm like, you need to talk to the condo president and get access to the financials just to assess the health of the association, because you don't want to be in a situation where you're saying, oh yeah, our condo fees are $250, but then they don't have nearly enough to cover any future capital expenditures that are going to be coming up because their actual operating expenses are higher than what they're collecting. And then you're stuck with a condo that, in 5 years, now there's this huge special assessment because they have to redo the parking lot and the roof's, was damaged and needs to be replaced. And it's just a really bad situation for you to be in. So yeah, I always encourage people to carefully review the financials to ensure that you're not getting yourself into a situation. And sometimes, to your point, they may say, wow, these fees are a little higher. And it's like, well, there may be a reason for it. We need to look at the financials to kind of give us a picture of what's going on.
Yeah. It's like people think that the money that they're paying is going into somebody's pocket.
Yeah.
A slush fund.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's like, no, this is for you. It's for the future, But anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, obviously you went through that process where you had, kind of a realization early on. You said, look, we're not going to be selling these all to investors because, to your point, it may cause complexities going forward if you want to, have new homeowners come in to buy the properties. The banks tend to kind of view townhomes and condos in some similar light. I'm sure there's some nuance to each one, but for the most part, you determined that it was probably a better move to try to see if you could focus your attention on new homeowners. And ultimately, although you had a slow start, you were able to kind of hit the ground running, and ultimately you've completed the development. After that project, I mean, what was your thought process? Like, what was your did you just say, wow, this is so great, let me go ahead and jump right into another townhome development, or did you pivot and try another project?
Yeah, well, that's what we wanted to do. Yeah, I mean, it was great. So we're like, we should absolutely find something else. And our realtor found another project, brought it to us. And so along the way, so this is kind of a funny thing. Like, I would always say to, like, my realtor, my engineer, I'm like, why do you guys, instead of charging your full fee, why don't you be like a part equity owner in something? And my engineer was like, he's like, I'm too analytical for that, and blah, 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 But in the next project, our realtor did jump in, and so he was actually part of it. And so, so we got a we bought 20 acres this time. And we knew that our project was, once you go through something, you learn things, and you're like, okay, we need a little bit wider streets, we need a little bit larger lots, things like that. So we had a much lower density. We did 152 units on 20 acres, so quite a bit lower density. And so we were like, okay, I remember we bought that in like October of whatever year, 2019 or whatever, or 18. I think it's 20. I think it was October 2018. And we're like, okay, let's get rolling. And here in a year, we'll be making these products and selling them at this price point. And again, we were targeting entry level, and we also had some private investors, and they have a manufacturing business, and they're like, one of the biggest challenges that we have is finding affordable places for our people to live. So they are like, we really like the townhomes, we really like entry level product, and say that they hopped in as our fourth part of the partnership. And so we start cruising along, and it's like, okay, this is great. We used the townhome exemption declaration before. Let's do it again, right? So it starts going through the city, and the city says, whoa, hold up. You guys want to do that on a 20-acre parcel? You want to avoid a subdivision? And we were actually meeting all the subdivision requirements except for one or two, but we were putting in normal width roads, and like there was nothing out of the ordinary. We weren't requesting to do any like weird variants or anything. We were just trying to get it done quickly. And they came together, and the city's like, okay, we need to have a meeting. They're like, you cannot use this townhome exemption declaration to build 152 units. That's just too much. And my attorney got a good chuckle out of it. And he's like, no, we can totally do this. And they're like, well, how are you allowed in our rules to do this? And so we met with the city, and we showed them, here's two different avenues that we can do this. And the city decided to call a moratorium on townhomes after that. And guess what? They changed those two rules. So we were forced to go through subdivision. And my attorney said, well, if you want to sue the city, you're going to win this case. But we're like, well, we're not going to do that. We want to move forward with them, So we ended up restarting everything in subdivision. And so it took 4 years to get a final plat on that subdivision, which we could have been building product 4 years ago. And now, had we been building product 4 years ago, we would have been done or nearly done with that subdivision today. And instead, we're like in phase 3. The product that we would have been selling back then would have been way cheaper. And again, anybody could have purchased it and afforded it back then. Now, that same product is in the high 4s or low 5s, and all of a sudden, people are having trouble affording it, especially with interest rates being where they are. So completely different, place from where we started to where we are. And it's in that nobody predicted the market. And while there were times where it's like, well, property values are going up, so this isn't so bad losing time. But you get to the back end of the project, it's like, wow, we wanted to build, product that was cost effective for people to buy, and now we can't. So it's still an entry level product, but with affordability and rates where they are, it's just a completely different place than where we started back then.
Are you finding the sales are slower, or do you have to pivot more towards investors or even build to rent? Or
yeah, sales are definitely slower. Several people in the neighborhood are renting. They rent very well, which is nice. I'm building some right now, and I've rented some of mine. Some of my partners have rented theirs. But I know some of my partners would have rather sold than to rent. But the market being slow, they're like, we don't want to sit on them. We'll just rent them out and sell them when the market gets hot again.
Yeah. Well, it just goes to show the long tail form of how development works. It's not, in theory, if you have everything go perfect, then maybe you could try to predict a timeline. But to your point, you had a situation where you had a completely, unexpected event happen where the city kind of changed up the rules on you, and now you had to contend with what was presented to you all. And so I think it kind of goes to show that, it's one of those things when you're taking on a development like you're talking about, where you're taking a parcel of land and having to potentially entitle the property, provide the infrastructure, and then ultimately phase out the project, that it can take multiple years. And this real estate environment is definitely cyclical. So there's scenarios where you're maybe in a phenomenal environment when you come in, and then there's a shift in the way that the Fed operates, and now the rates have ticked up more than what it was expected. And with all the geopolitical things that are happening, it's creating some uncertainty in the marketplace. But it's possible to predict. It's one of those things where that's why I think your experience helps, because you could say, okay, even in those scenarios, I'm accounting for a lot of this stuff trying to come into it. And you can't eliminate risk altogether, but when you have a lot more experience like you have, you can try to mitigate some of that risk going into it, and then hopefully come out on the other side in a good enough situations.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how much local development is affected by national or international or other things that are so far beyond our control,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's material prices or interest rates, But yeah, even locally, some
Yeah.
things are just so far out of your control.
Well, yeah, I mean, you talked about that, them changing up the rules on you, and I've heard of cities do something similar in my market as well, where it's they're really against a certain thing, and they kind of, I don't want to say rig, but they they do things to where they try to deny you your ability to operate, even though the legislation itself allows for you to operate. We actually had a situation where one of my clients, he wanted to open up a rental car business in this particular property, and the zoning allowed for it, but there was a comprehensive plan that was created years before, and the city manager was trying to say, well, we're going to go off what the comprehensive plan says. We don't want to go off of what the actual zoning is to allow for that particular use. And so they denied our claim to be able to operate on site. And so we had to appeal to the board that allows for these determinations, and it was pretty close. We were sweating bullets. We were in the audience, and obviously I wasn't the one presenting, but we had an advocate for us on the stand, essentially providing insight as to why we believe this was the way that it should be operated. And there was a board of, I believe, 5 people, and we got a 3-2 vote. So we barely got approval, even though it was clear as day in the zoning laws that allowed for that to operate, the business to operate on site. It came down to literally 1 vote to allow us to do it. So it was kind of, I think sometimes people think that this world of business and real estate is black and white, when in reality it's a lot of color, and you kind of have to work through the situation.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned partnerships within the second one, and clearly you hit some challenges that were pretty intense. How did those partnerships, and how are they working out so far? Are they glad they did it? Are they understanding that this is where the shifts are and where we need to go through phasing, and then also whatever you're hanging on to, renting or selling? How has that worked out so far?
Yeah, well, so in those particular ones, it got challenging at a certain point for sure, because we had people that wanted an exit if an exit was possible, while some of us were like, no, let's keep going. So ultimately we ended up, we had one partner said, hey, I'll buy the group out. And I had been thinking about buying the group out, but I was also looking at other subdivisions. And so I said, okay, that's fine. You take this one. I'm going to go run after some other things. But outside of that, I was also in some other partnerships with different groups developing homes in different parts of town, and those ones went really well. One was development on a golf course, and we built quite a few homes, and everything worked out really well. And we just got to the point where we ran out of lots to build on together. And they have future phases. I think they've got another 100 and some odd lots to go in future phases that they're working on creating. So that's a partnership that I see coming back around and continuing to work. But I think, I think the opportunity is there. One of the hard things that we ran into with this last one was you start with a plan of like, here's where we're going to go. Like, we're going to build entry-level product for people. And then after a while, I think it was kind of around the time where I was like, well, this is not so entry-level anymore. Then part of the group's like, well, let's not build entry-level product then. If we can't build it, let's just sell lots or whatever, So while we were all sailing in one direction, all of a sudden people wanted to go in a different direction, and that was tough. So we ended up figuring out how to deal with that. I mean, with real estate, like you can't, when you buy a piece of real estate, right? You can't really have a preconceived notion of like, this is the only thing I'm going to do with it, because the market changes. So you kind of have to be constantly open to what is the best use of this product today? And if that changes down the road, then you're asking yourself, what's the best use of this product today? And maybe you're like, well, let's just say like townhomes aren't doing well, but single families are. So maybe you do some boundary line relocations and you create lots, or maybe you change your next phasing so that you have more single family or whatever. But, there are times where you just have to make a shift. And so I think some of my partnerships, they've wanted to shift in the same direction as me, which has worked out, and other ones haven't. And so it's just been a matter of, well, what works and what doesn't, And we also, like we started building for another developer. They're an out-of-state developer, and we started building vertically for them. And when we started with them, the market was in a different spot as today, and they're like, yeah, we're gonna go fast. We're gonna put up all these different products, and they started real fast out of the chute. But again, the market shifted really bad, and the product sat, and so it's changed what they wanted to do. And so now we're looking at building some different product with them now, just because the market is different than where it was. But that partnership's still moving forward as of now, which is great.
That's awesome. So, after going through all these experiences, it looks like you have been in different phases on different townhome projects. You've done some higher end residential development, and you've shifted in a variety of different capacities. What advice would you give to people that are listening to this podcast about development as a whole? So if they're looking to start their first project, what advice would you give?
Well, I'd probably start with, what are there's obviously a lot of different possibilities, right? Like I always describe real estate like a train station. It's like there's always a new deal coming in, but you got all these different types of train cars. It's like, are you doing apartments? Are you doing tiny homes? Are you doing townhomes? Are you doing a luxury? Like, there's all these different possibilities of things that you could actually develop. And then you got commercial stuff and strip malls, like, and everything's going up and down. And when one thing's hot, something else is not. And so I think the biggest thing is just understanding what for your local market, like what is the current thing, but trying to figure out what is the next current thing, or where is it heading? Like, where are you in that curve, right? Because you don't want to buy something that all of a sudden is overbuilt. And I think the other thing is like having a good plan B with that property. So like I've talked to people that are like, oh, this is a great development for multi-million-dollar custom homes. I'm like, okay, yep, agree. There's a market for that right now. But like if things go sideways, what are you going to do with that? And if the only thing you can do is build multi-million-dollar homes, you're sitting on that sucker for a while, right? And the same thing goes for anything else. So I think having a plan where it's like, okay, this lot gives me a lot of different options, and those options are good. That's nice. There's a piece of property here in town that I tried working on the owner privately. I found out who he was. He's an out-of-state guy, played professional football. I worked on him for a while to try to buy it, and he finally listed it for sale. So what's funny is I got a hold of this guy, contacted him, talked to him. I introduced him to another fellow that lives up here that plays professional football. And when the guy finally decided that he was ready to move forward with the project, he didn't call me. He called the guy that I introduced him to that played professional football, and they listed it for sale. And I was like, geez, guys, you could have just called me, and you don't even need to put it on the market. Like, let's go. And so I said, well, let's start getting this under contract. And so we're writing it up because I had already done the numbers a couple of years ago. I knew right where we were. He now listed it. So we had this little gap difference of like where I was originally a couple of years ago and where he was today. And I'm like, yeah, let's just find our sweet spot and move forward. And as we were writing up, I said to my friend who I introduced him to, I said, we should just check the zoning real fast just to make sure. And so he pulls up the zoning. And in those 2 years, the county changed the zoning to where we could no longer build what we planned to build. And they changed it to a zoning that for what you now have to build, there's no infrastructure. It's going to sit for a long time. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so I called the county. I said, and they just rezoned it. Like it was like a couple of months, like boop, rezoned. And I was like, oh my gosh. I'm like, is there a way to undo this zoning for what it was? Because if so, I'll buy it and do this. And the guy at the county, he laughed on the phone. He was like, you know how long we've been working on this? And I'm like, well, I said, I've been trying to buy this parcel for a couple of years. I didn't know that this was going through. And he's like, well, he said, we sent letters to the owner. He would have known. I don't think he was paying a lot of attention to what they were doing, because he's like, he could have requested to kept his zoning. And so anyways, he's still sitting on that parcel today. It's going to take a long time for him to sell it now, but that was kind of a funny thing. But anyway, sorry, I got a little sidetrack off your question. But yeah, like I think finding out what works in your area, having something that is more than just apartments or more than just, whatever it is, having something that works with a plan B is, I think, key, because the market shifts and you can't control it, and you can't just keep on with your preconceived notion of I'm building this and just keep shoving it out there. Because at some point, if you're wrong, you're so far wrong that there's no recovery from it, right?
Yeah,
One of the
contingency
things, so
planning.
in our very first development with those 56 townhomes, when we went to the bank and we were going through our final loan approval process, the banker, he was an older guy, very, very well seasoned in the real estate game. And we're sitting at the table and he looks at me and he says, so what's your plan B if this doesn't work? Because no one had done a townhome development this large ever.
Mhm.
And I said, my plan B is we'll just rent them all out. And he looked at me with this like look and he's like, what are you talking about? And I said, look at the numbers. And he looked at the numbers and he's like, you could actually rent all of these and they'd cash flow from day one. I was like, yep. And he
Mhm.
says, that's the best plan B I think I've ever seen, because most of the time you can't just do that,
Yeah.
And so anyways, we ended up getting our loan and moving on with life. But I think that's, you've got to mentally be able to think outside the box, mentally be able to pivot when you need to pivot, but your property needs to be able to pivot. And yeah, but I kind of felt bad for this guy that got locked in with his land that got rezoned. And it's like, geez, like,
Yeah. It
you
happens.
had a great shot there, and now not looking so good.
Yeah, no, it definitely happens. I've had a client one time where we were going through the process of listing their property, and it was on a nice hard corner in a kind of good thoroughfare, and historically the property had been zoned a particular zoning, and there was this blanket rezoning that occurred a couple years before that he was unaware of. He said, and ultimately it negated the uses that would have ultimately been the highest and best for that building. We provided him with an analysis, and he was kind of taken aback about what we were presenting him. And I said, well, this is the situation. Unless you get this property rezoned, given the area it's in, it's an area where there's a lot of, it's very difficult to get stuff rezoned. Let's just say that it's a very tight knit community, and there's a lot of NIMBYism in the area. So the likelihood of it getting rezoned is pretty low. And so it's like you're either here or don't sell the property. I mean, it just is what it is. So
yeah,
sometimes it's a hard pill to swallow, but it's what the reality is.
You've mentioned a few times that you wanted starter homes and different things about community focused. What would you say for you and your market? What does community driven development mean for you specifically and the types of projects that you're doing and that you're going to choose to do in the future?
Yeah, well, I do like the entry level product. Giving people the opportunity to get into a house or a townhome, being able to get into the real estate game. I mean, it's very meaningful. It's meaningful to me when I bought my very first condo in California, this tiny little box, 1,200 square feet. It was so expensive. And I'm like, how can I be able to afford this? And so, it's always been something that I've liked. I mean, we'll build the multi-million-dollar customs, and I really enjoy those. I love working with clients, but it just being able to help somebody move it out of rentership and into home ownership it's rewarding, right? And so I like that. And so we'll do a bit of that type of neighborhood. I mean, right now I've got a subdivision that is all super high end stuff, and then we've got our entry level stuff. But so I'll keep looking everywhere. In some bigger markets, right? Like you can build your niche. Like, oh, I only do townhomes, or I only do whatever it is, But in my market, we're small, and so you've got to be a versatile builder. I mean, that's just the reality of what it is, because you can't just carve out a giant niche in a small market. But I think the whole community piece, like every community needs something. It needs something different. When I first moved back to Montana, when I was looking at this townhome development with my partner, I went and met with some property managers, and I met with these two twin gals one day, and I was talking to them about, what if we had to go plan B and rent these out? Because I was nervous about that. And they're like, oh, no problem at all. I said, really? And they said, yeah. They said, Missoula is over 50% renters. And I was like, really? It's that high? And she's like, yep. And it's still way over 50% renters. And granted, like we do have a university here, and so that maybe sways it a little bit. But the reality is, like, we have a lot of renters in a town that you would just think like, oh, there's a higher home ownership here, And so, building for what your community needs is part of it. One of the things too, like when I worked at Centex Homes, one of the things they taught us was they're like, we're not here to just build a house. We're here to build a community. We want things that go together, things that are planned, well thought out, So I've driven by people's developments where they build the exact same house every time. They paint them all the same. And it's truly cookie cutter, like perfectly cookie cutter, right? And so when we started, we had 2 plans. We ended up making 3 plans. But I was like, I don't want this to look cookie cutter, So I was like, so I went to my partner. I said, do you care if I spend a little bit more money on the outside of these things to make them look different? So like, we'll do 2 gable hips and then we'll do a hip roof and then 2 more gable roofs and then a hip roof. And we went rotating down the street. And then we did some where it was all siding. We did some with rock. We did some with metal. Like, so when you drive down, like, yeah, there's only 2 or 3 plans, but and then we had, I don't know, we probably did 16 or 18 different colors throughout instead of just 1 or 2. And so when people would come through, while it was very similar floor plans and starter, it didn't feel cookie cutter. People would tell me that all the time. And the investors liked it too. They did. But, and when we sold them, like if one had stone on it and one had siding, obviously the stone will cost more, but we didn't even charge more for the stone. We were just kind of looking at holistically with the whole community of like, how do we make this feel, like more of like hey, this is your first home and it's truly a home and it's not just like this cookie cutter thing. Because you go from the renter world to the home ownership world, and if you went because like a lot of rentals, they are totally copy and paste and you're in this big giant unit and outside everything looks the same. And so I'm like, I think they'd appreciate going to something that has more of a individualistic feel than just repeat. So I don't know, I guess for me, community driven is it's kind of a broad from building what your community needs, but also building something that has a community sense rather than just, I'm just here to build one house.
Yeah, it's being deliberate about the way that you approach development versus just saying what's going to give me the best ROI. Because I feel like there's a lot of people that are attracted to development for the financial aspects, but I think there should be at least a corporate or for lack of a better word, corporate social responsibility, where it's like you're delivering a product to the marketplace, but you're also wanting to be, it's just important for you to consider how this product is going to be received by those who ultimately live there, because they're the ones who are going to be using the space. And the hope is that you deliver something that is ultimately going to be a net positive for the area versus something that's just kind of, you do it for the dollars and cents. So it's good that you're just, taking that approach when you're taking on development projects. Well, Lance, we obviously greatly appreciate your time. I think it was very helpful, the discussion. And it's great to be able to talk to people from all across the country, because you do get more and more perspective about ways that people can take on projects. And, the more and more we talk to people, then hopefully you start seeing some similarities between the way people do things, and maybe you can take that and apply it to your own development. So I was going to ask you regarding if people wanted to learn more about what you do, wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, I mean, we do have a website, obviously, and social medias out there. We've got a Facebook page and an Instagram page. I think our Instagram is Lance Cox Inc. But I mean, that's a fine way. But if somebody really has some questions, I mean, I would reach out either through like the website connect link, or I think we've got our business phone on there, or just a direct message on Instagram.
Yeah. And we'll make sure to include that in the show notes. So if you guys are watching this on YouTube, go in the description. You'll be able to access that. And if you guys are watching this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any other medium, feel free to go in the description as well, and then you'll be able to gain access to that. So, all right. Well, Lance, again, thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciate all the insights you shared. I know that our audience is going to gain a lot of value from it. If you guys are watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. It makes a huge impact on our ability to reach a broader audience, and we greatly appreciate the support. Along with that, if you guys will listen to us in a podcast format, whether that's Apple Podcast or Spotify, please leave a 5-star review. It helps us reach a broader audience, and ultimately we want to be able to make sure that people who listen to this podcast and get inspired to take on developments in their own community. So thanks again so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time.